An inherent problem with the small size of insects is separation of the sexes by relatively large distances. Much is known about how various groups have solved this problem through largely acoustical, chemical, and visual communication for effective mate finding. A long recognized but little explored mode of intersexual communication is use of low-frequency, substrate-borne vibrational signals. Only in the past few decades has there been much effort to study how this mode differs from airborne acoustical communication, how widespread it is in insects, and how it has evolved. Representatives of these 10 insect orders are known to have adopted vibrational communication, primarily for locating mates. The signals produced by most of them consist of simple volleys of evenly spaced vibrations. The methods of vibration production are indicated for each order, and these various methods are summarized here. Percussion is considered to be the ancestral method, and the various forms of stridulation and ultimately tremulation are the derived behaviors. The vibrational mode of communication is a viable evolutionary strategy, particularly for small insects that are limited in development of sound-producing structures that can effectively produce air-transmitted waves. The biophysical aspects of these vibrations in solid substrates are complex, but we do know that the various waveforms offer good possibilities for location of an emitter by a receiver and for supplying recognition characters in the emitter's language. The range of vibrational communication is somewhat restricted by the distortion and dampening of waves in natural substrates, but this is not a major problem since transmission through plants, dead plant stems, and connected leaf mats has been demonstrated for distances up to 8 meters that translate to 800 to 1,000 times or more the length of insects' bodies. We still know little about how males or females are able to measure the vibrational input against their selectively arrived at neuronal template that is apparently encoded to respond only to a conspecific mate and possibly to a more fit potential mate. But pairing experiments and playback experiments with stoneflies using computer models have proven that at least some of these conspecific recognition and fitness characters are present, particularly in the male call signals. For example, we have found that the stonefly Turnarcella females can discern the fitness of particular males that are duetting with her by measuring the time required by them to find her. She remains stationary only for the time allocated for the fit male to find her. If a particular male spends an inordinate time in searching, then she moves on to a different position, possibly to establish a duet with another male. This reduces the time during which her response signals make her vulnerable to vibration-detecting predators, such as spiders. In vibrational communication, receivers determine the directional location of a signal producer by integrating time delays as small as 0.2 milliseconds of waves received by subgenual organs of the different legs that are planted on the substrate like points on a compass. Distance to an emitter may be determined by the intensity of wave signals received above some threshold. Little is known of the energy cost of vibrational signaling as a component of reproductive effort, but generally it is considered less than for producing high-frequency airborne sounds. Leighton in 1987 found that percussion-assisted mate finding in the tenebrionid beetle Symposia was less than 10% of the cost of random searching over its communicable range. This low cost has probably been a major factor in the adoption of the vibrational mode by many small insects. Our investigations of drumming behavior and signals of 130 North American and New Zealand stonefly species and the work on European species by Professor Rainer Ruprecht of Johannes Gutenberg University in Germany over the past 20 years have indicated that stoneflies of the suborder Arctopolaria have evolved the most diverse and complex system of vibrational communication known in insects. Only the leafhoppers and delphacid planthoppers, recently studied in Susan Hetty's laboratory at Ohio State University, possibly have evolved systems as complex as those of stoneflies. Outgroup comparisons indicate that ancestral stonefly signals were monophasic volleys of evenly spaced drum beats. These probably originated from accidental bumping of the abdomen, first by males, then subsequently by stationary females, that were selectively reinforced toward behavioral percussion, and that derived signaling to achieve species specificity and possibly to enable sexual selection or some measure of reproductive fitness has involved modification of the ancestral form toward complex signals through changes in the rhythmic patterning of male calls or patterns of male-female duetting and or changes in the method of signal production, such as scraping, rubbing, or tremulation, associated with election of particular natural substrates. Modern species either have retained a more ancestral pattern with slight modifications for species specificity, or have developed various complex systems using combinations of the derived behaviors. Interestingly, we have been able to identify in the many species we have studied almost every conceivable pattern of change from the simple ancestral monophasy. The high degree of species specificity in this fixed action, genetically programmed behavior make it a valuable line of evidence for delineating morphologically cryptic species and for resolving phylogenetic relationships. The entire mating system of stoneflies involves not only communication, but also the associated aggregation and movement behaviors of both sexes. The typical system of Arctopolaria involves a complex of behaviors, including initial aggregation of sexes at encounter sites, calling by males with species-specific signals during a ranging search, duet establishment with a receptive virgin female if effective vibrational communication distance from her is achieved, a localized search by the male in a triangulation or other pattern for the now stationary female while both continue duetting, and almost immediate mating after the male initially locates and contacts the female. Males are polygamous and continue calling and searching during their short reproductive lives. Typically, mated and unguarded females reject subsequent male advances by raising and curving their abdomens. My investigations of several species of the southern hemisphere stonefly suborder Antarctopolaria, such as this beautiful green stonefly, Stenoperla mcclellani, and observations by several stonefly workers in Australia, New Zealand, and South America over several years, indicate that members of this suborder are non-drummers and have never adopted vibrational communication. Their mating systems are unknown, but I believe they may have evolved a highly specific encounter site aggregation behavior that brings the sexes sufficiently close together to accommodate mate finding. At the 11th International Stonefly Symposium in Tree Haven, Wisconsin, and in my 1994 paper in Aquatic Insects, I proposed the probable encounter site conventions of stoneflies based on my own experience and observations of my fellow stonefly workers. I adapted descriptors for these such as bank scrambler, bush topper, and tree topper from the concept of hill topping and butterflies described by Shields in 1967. These encounter site behaviors have undoubtedly been selectively reinforced by reproductive success and represent the initial aggregation of sexes in mate encounter that, at least in the Arctopolarian stoneflies, get them close enough together for vibrational communication to effectively come into play. Assuming this initial aggregation, let's now look at examples of the basic call signal and duetting patterns that male and female stoneflies use to get together. You will see and hear in these examples that follow that the male calls are more complex than female answers, since they must convey to females the critical information of species specificity and possibly reproductive fitness to stimulate female receptivity. Assuming that females can discern this information in the call, her answers need only acknowledge his calls and repeatedly report her stationary location, neither of which require complex signals. Also, in some of the examples that follow, you'll be hearing audio signals dubbed into the tape of appropriate species you're watching. Ancestral calls and answers were produced by percussion and were monophasic signals of even spacing and little amplitude modulation, as in this Teniopteryx lonicera duet. Note that the female answers the male call in sequence. Other examples of ancestral duetting are shown in these video sequences of Teniopteryx ugula from West Virginia and Pteronarcella badia from Colorado. The simplest ways to derive specificity from the ancestral model would have been to shorten or lengthen the monophasic signals by changing the number of beats or the even time intervals between beats, or start chorusing the female answer into the male call, such as we see in this preloaded stonefly, Chernochorus misnomus. Numerous numerous species in all 9 arctopolarian families of stoneflies have such modified species-specific calls, ranging from 2 to 40 drum beats and having distinct intervals ranging from 13 to 3,350 milliseconds. The most complex evolved signal patterns in stoneflies have resulted from major changes in the rhythm of percussion-produced signals or from modified methods of producing the vibrations and change in rhythm. Such complex signals have been accompanied in various species by appearance of specialized abdominal structures and syncyllae for producing and monitoring the signal. Secondly, by substrate election to produce unique frequencies in stridulating species. And lastly, by increased capacity of the nervous system to integrate the more complex information content of the signals. Let's now look at some of the major complex patterns and specialized signaling methods that I have identified in the substantial number of species studied. The pearlid stonefly Bellonaria georgiana males call with a percussion-produced tri-grouped signal, answered by the female in sequence with an ancestral monophasic signal. The capneid stonefly Mesocapnia frysoni males call with multiple rapid burst groups of percussion, answered with 1 or 2 female burst groups. A typical pattern in several species of the family Perlotidae is a symphonic duetting, created by the rhythmic repeating of short groups of beats by the male, interspersed with 1 or 2 taps by the female, as shown in the upper left inset of this photo of Isogenoides olivaceus. The signals you hear are actually of its congener Isogenoides zinensis. In zinensis, the signal is very complex in that females, after a short symphony, start to sequence their answers to the 3 to 4 beat male call, and the male then acknowledges the female answer with a 2 or 3 beat signal. In other words, we get a 3-way duet or communication, as you can see in the lower right inset. The perlotid Cogotus modestus carries group calling 1 step further by producing rapid bi-beat call groups. Playback experiments with computer-simulated variations of this Cogotus call have shown this bi-beat character to be critical in female recognition. The specialized calls of some Peltoperlidae, Perlotidae, Chloroperlidae, and Perlidae species consist of 2 percussion phases having different numbers of beats and often very different interbeat spacing. These calls are usually answered by a simple monophasic female signal, and then the male of some species typically acknowledges the answer with a simple monophasic signal. Here we see and hear 2 examples of this phased calling pattern and 3-way triads in the Peltoperlid species Viaperla ada, and the perlid species Acronuria abnormis. Acronuria abnormis also produces what I have called a type 2 call, in which the first phase is produced by rubbing and the second by percussion. These diphasic signals are most often made by males having modified sternal structures on the abdomen that I reviewed in a 1991 paper in Aquatic Insects. These structures are of three basic types. First, movable vesicles, like we see here in this scanning electron micrograph of segment 9 of Teniopteryx nivalis and Teniopteryx mara. These vesicles are used for percussion. The second type, non-movable lobes, as shown here on segment 7 of the Prolotid Chernoculus misnomus in Isoperlamuri. Lobes are also used for percussion. And the third types, the raised knobs and hammers of Cystelegnathan families that are used for either tapping, scraping, or rubbing on the substrate. Here we see a knob on segment 9 of these male peltoperlids, Talaperla lisa and Talaperla maria, and a hammer on this perlid, Dorinuria baumannii. The most specialized calls in Plecoptera that involve abdominal contact are made by males rubbing the substrate with these ventral abdominal knobs or hammers. Each rub is a prolonged percussion stroke with the textured ventral surface of the knob or hammer, which may either be ridged, as in this Acronuria evoluta hammer, or papillus, as in this Calonuria californica hammer. These structures are dragged or rubbed across the substrate, producing on resonant substrates a squeaking sound. I have described this unique vibration-producing behavior as an abdominal to substrate stridulation. Calls of various species we have studied produce 1 to 7 rubs, always answered by females with percussion. And remember that Acronuria abnormis seems to represent a transition in behavior, producing phase 1 of its call with either percussion or rubbing, and phase 2 always by percussion. Here we see and hear the three-way communication of Calonuria californica, with the male having a single rub call. And the duet of Peltoperla arcuata, with the male also having a single rub call of varying amplitude. It is interesting in these exchanges that if rubbing males acknowledge female answers, they always do it with percussion. And now we come to the very specialized non-contact calling by tremulation that has been found thus far only in 3 species of the family Chloroperlidae. 2 European species of Siphonoperla perla produce these signals in plants by rapid vertical movements of the abdomen, and Kevin Alexander has discovered by individual frame and slow motion videotape analysis that the North American Suwalia pallidula produced their typical 3-stroke tremulation signal with forward-backward rocking motions of the whole body, shown in this simulation. In summary, we can say that this diverse and exciting language system of Northern Hemisphere stoneflies indicates that they represent the epitome of evolutionary development of vibrational communication in insects. They've evolved an advantageous strategy of males calling and searching, and females answering and waiting for a fit male within communicable distance to find her within a reasonable time frame. So we know quite a lot about the encounter sites and vibrational calling and duetting components of Arctopolarian mate finding systems, but very little about the critically important follow-up step of the localized search, whereby a male utilizes the vibrational information from a female to actually find her. We began approaching this question of searching behavior about 6 years ago, with experiments and observations of 4 species selected from different encounter site conventions. This approach was based on the hypothesis that ground scramblers would have a different searching behavior and patterns on contoured stream-back surfaces than, say, bush toppers or tree toppers on a branched plant substrate, and the assumption that the currently arrived at system of any species should combine effective vibrational signaling with an efficient search modality. Our first experiments involved videotaping of duetting and movement sequences of virgin pairs of a real Caneos, Colorado population of Pteronarcella, randomly placed in an experimental arena. Even in this unnatural setting for a bush topper, we found that the average find time for pairs engaging in strong, continuous duets was significantly shorter than those for non-duetting or anomalously duetting pairs, and that their local search patterns involved a male triangulation aided by the vibrational cues from answering females. Here you see an animated diagrammatic depiction of a complete and typical drumming triangulation pattern in the experimental arena. Next, Kevin Alexander and I followed up on casual observations I had made of the nighttime searching of the large pearlid stonefly Clausinia sabulosa several years ago. We took advantage of the poor vision of most insects in red wavelengths of light and found that we could take Clausinia movements during their nighttime reproductive escapades with red light without apparent disturbance. Males of this Gunnison River, Colorado population emerged and became active significantly earlier after dark than females, and they began immediately drumming and searching near the shoreline on isolated stones that protruded above the shallow water surface. Male searching consisted of running across the shallow water surface and circling and scrambling over high areas and angular sections of individual rock encounter sites that corresponded with female emergence sites. The drumming duets you hear, recorded in the lab, are not transmitted on these stones and are therefore non-functional at these encounter sites. You can read in our 1996 paper in the Annals of the Entomological Society of America why we consider drumming, at least in this population, to be an evolutionary carryover, superseded by an efficient encounter site aggregation finding system. Several males of Clausinia often found an emerging female. The first and successful one in mating guarded her from other males. Since our work in the lab with Pteronocerella baedia, a bush topper, revealed a triangulation search pattern on the unnatural flat surface, we decided we needed to determine the searching behavior and pattern of a tree topper in relation to drumming on a more natural branch system. We selected the prolific pearlid drummer Perlinella drymo for these experimental trials and videotaped search sequences of virgin pairs on a tree branch substrate in the laboratory. Each experimental trial consisted of releasing a female at the base of the branch and allowing her free movement until she moved to an upper stem, then releasing a male at the same starting point as the female and videotaping all subsequent drumming and movements. As predicted, duetting increased male searching activity, influenced their directional movements, and decreased the time required to find females, in contrast to non-duetting pairs. Males, interestingly, never called at branch bifurcations. When a male reached a fork, he randomly traveled up one side or the other, drumming at some point beyond the fork. If he first traveled up the side not leading to the female, then her answer signal came from behind him, causing him to turn and travel back to the fork and take the other correct side. This process was repeated at each fork until he achieved the stem leading directly to the answering female. Duetting was established in 80% of the trials attempted, indicating a strong tendency toward vibrational communication, and females were found in most trials within 10 minutes, the actual time depending on the distance traveled, number of forks tested, and probably fitness of the male selected for the trial. These experiments proved that female answers provided information on her stationary location that males were able to integrate to correct his turns and directional movements toward her. This work was reported in 1996 in the Swiss Journal of Entomology and is really the first experimental evidence to support the long-held belief that drumming would aid mate finding on a branched encounter site. Our most recent work on search behavior dealt with the chloropurlid stonefly Suwalia pallidula that is a bush topper tremulator. Our approach here was patient, repeated videotaping of natural movements of males and females in the field, in the riparian bush vegetation of Quartz Creek in Colorado. In this case, we are dealing with communication involving vibration produced by tremulation on leaves. The search pattern of males consisted of a fly tremulate search pattern, similar to the fly and call pattern reported for delphacid leafhoppers by Hetty and Nault. Males flew and landed on riparian shrubs in late afternoon on sunny days and began calling on leaves with its typical three-stroke tremulation signal. Females answered with a typical one-stroke signal and then moved to the petiole leaf junction and became stationary. This typical positioning ensures that the male does not have to search each entire leaf. The males search the petioles and bases of leaves as they are encountered, while intermittently duetting with the female and repeating until she was found. Copulation occurred on the upper surface of leaves. Willow made up 62% and alder 34% of the bush vegetation at the study site. Yet Sewallia occurred and searched significantly more frequently on alder, apparently preferring it as the primary encounter site. In summary, these studies indicate that the finding systems of Perlinella drymo, Clausinia sabulosa, and Sewallia pallidula all conform to the hypothetical systems proposed by me in 1994. They all utilize an encounter site for initial aggregation of sexes. Their males engage in arranging search at the encounter site while intermittently calling for females with species-specific vibrational signals, and except for Clausinia sabulosa, duets are established that allow the male to begin a more localized search for the female, whose answers give him repeated information about her location. As expected, search patterns related to the type of substrate at the encounter site. Sewallia pallidula had a fly tremulate search pattern. Clausinia sabulosa had a rock-to-rock pattern at a restricted groundwater level site. And Perlinella drymo had a fly-run-drum search pattern on a branch. Two interesting departures in the findings of these studies from what we expected were, one, that the male searching of Pteronos alabadia in the arena was not a direct homing on the female with aid of her signals, but a triangulation seemingly to gain several fixes on the female's position before making a direct approach to her, and two, that Perlinella drymo did not test each fork of a branch system with calling to more directly determine the correct side to search. I expect further research on mate searching in stoneflies to reveal exciting and diverse patterns of behavior that, at least in the arctopolaria, have probably co-evolved with vibrational communication.